The room was already loud before I even stood up. Our neighborhood HOA board meeting had turned into a shouting match, and at the center of it all was Cynthia Calder, the HOA president who loved acting like she owned the entire community. She slammed her folder against the table and pointed straight at me. "Daniel Harper has been spreading lies about the board and creating unnecessary panic in this neighborhood," she snapped. Several people shifted in their chairs. A few neighbors avoided eye contact with me entirely. I took a slow breath and tried to stay calm. "All I did," I said, "was point out that you blocked the only fire lane serving the upper hillside homes." Cynthia scoffed like the idea was ridiculous. "The landscaping project improved the neighborhood," she said. "Those decorative stone barriers make the entrance look upscale." Behind her, I could see a few residents whispering nervously to each other. Everyone in that room knew exactly which road I was talking about. Then suddenly, the clubhouse windows flashed bright red. Emergency lights. A fire truck rolled into the parking lot outside, its engine rumbling through the quiet street. The room went completely silent as heavy boots approached the door. Cynthia tried to continue the meeting anyway. But before she could finish her sentence, the door swung open. A fire marshal stepped inside and scanned the room. "We're here to inspect a blocked fire lane," he said calmly. And in that moment, Cynthia's confident smile finally started to disappear. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? 2 years earlier, when I first moved into the hillside neighborhood, the place felt like exactly the quiet escape I had been looking for. I had bought a modest property with a small workshop attached to it, tucked along the upper road that curved through the hills above town. The view was incredible, the air was calm, and most of the neighbors seemed friendly enough when I first arrived. People waved when you drove past. Kids rode bikes in the evenings. It felt peaceful. The neighborhood did have a homeowners association, but at first it didn't seem like a big deal. The HOA board was led by Cynthia Calder, a woman who ran meetings like she was chairing a courtroom. The rules were strict: lawn height, mailbox colors, fence styles, but nothing completely unreasonable. At least that's what I thought at the beginning. What most people didn't realize was how important the narrow service road behind the houses really was. Because our home sat along a steep hillside, there was only one official emergency access route for the upper section of the neighborhood. It ran behind the houses and had always been clearly marked as a fire lane. Emergency vehicles had used it before during brush fires and medical calls. Then a few months ago, the HOA announced what Cynthia proudly called a beautification project. Without much discussion, the board approved a landscaping plan for the back road. Workers showed up one morning and started placing large decorative stone barriers and concrete planters along the edge of the lane. Except they didn't stop at the edge. They placed several of those heavy stone blocks directly across the fire lane itself. At first, people assumed it was temporary, but when the work was finished, the emergency access path was completely blocked. A few neighbors mentioned it quietly to each other. Everyone agreed it looked strange, but nobody wanted to challenge the HOA board. Except me. I pulled up the county fire safety regulations online and read through them carefully. The moment I saw the rules about emergency access lanes, my stomach dropped. Blocking that road wasn't just a bad idea. It was a clear fire code violation. When I brought it up during the next HOA meeting, Cynthia barely let me finish my sentence. She waved her hand like she was brushing off a child asking a silly question. "You're misunderstanding the situation," she said calmly. The improvements were approved properly. After that meeting, things changed quickly. Within a week, I started receiving formal HOA warning letters accusing me of interfering with board decisions. Then one evening, I opened my mailbox and found a sealed notice waiting inside. According to the HOA board, I was now officially being warned to stop spreading misinformation about community improvements. The next HOA meeting was packed. Word had spread through the neighborhood that something was going on between me and the board, and people were curious. Some came to watch. Others probably came to make sure they stayed on Cynthia Calder's good side. I sat quietly through the first half of the meeting while the board discussed landscaping budgets and mailbox repainting rules. Cynthia ran everything with the same polished authority she always had, speaking confidently like every decision had already been made long before the meeting started. When the floor finally opened for homeowner comments, I stood up. "I'd like to talk about the fire lane behind the hillside houses," I said. Cynthia didn't even look at me. "We're not discussing that tonight," she replied flatly. A few people in the room exchanged looks. I could feel the tension building immediately. "I checked the county safety codes," I continued, trying to keep my voice calm. That road has to stay open for emergency vehicles. Before Cynthia could interrupt again, a woman near the back of the room raised her hand. Maria Gutierrez had lived in the neighborhood longer than most of us. That road was used during the brush fire about 6 years ago, she said carefully. The fire trucks came up that lane behind our homes. Cynthia's expression hardened. That situation no longer applies, she said sharply. The board determined the lane was unnecessary. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Later that night, I called the local fire department directly. I wasn't trying to cause problems. I just wanted a clear answer from someone who actually knew the safety rules. The fire prevention officer didn't hesitate. If that road is marked as a fire lane, he told me, it must remain clear at all times. The next morning, I emailed the HOA board explaining what I had learned and letting them know the fire department had been contacted. That's when everything turned openly hostile. Cynthia sent a response accusing me of trying to embarrass the HOA and create panic in the neighborhood. 2 days later, another violation notice appeared in my mailbox. This one claimed I had made unauthorized complaints to city agencies. At the bottom of the letter was a final line that made it clear the situation wasn't going away. The HOA board would be holding a special meeting the following week to deal with what Cynthia called residents undermining the authority of the association. Over the next few days, Cynthia made sure the entire neighborhood knew exactly who she blamed for the problem. According to her, I wasn't a resident trying to raise a safety concern. I was the guy creating drama. More than once, I heard neighbors repeating the same lines Cynthia had used in her email, that I was stirring panic over something the HOA board had already approved. A couple of her supporters even came to my driveway one afternoon. One of them folded his arms and asked why I felt the need to bring the fire department into community matters. I kept my voice calm and explained the same thing I had said from the beginning. That road is an emergency access lane. But they just shook their heads like I was the one being unreasonable. The strange part was what happened when the conversations ended. Several neighbors who had stayed quiet during those confrontations came over later, speaking in lower voices. They admitted they had been worried about the blocked lane too. One man told me his wife had mentioned the same concern weeks earlier, but they didn't want to challenge the HOA board. Nobody wants Cynthia targeting their house next, he said. Then the situation started proving my point on its own. A large delivery truck arrived at one of the homes uphill and struggled to navigate the tight street because the fire lane was blocked by the stone barriers. The driver had to back down the road slowly while several residents stood outside directing him. A few days later, during a heavy rainstorm, an ambulance responding to a medical call nearly passed the correct house because it had to circle the long way around the neighborhood. That was the moment I realized this was no longer just a disagreement with the HOA, it was a safety issue. So I started documenting everything. I took photos of the barriers blocking the fire lane, the warning signs that had been partially covered by landscaping, and the narrow space emergency vehicles now had to squeeze through. Then I sent everything to the fire marshal's office. Meanwhile, Cynthia was preparing for the special HOA meeting she had announced. Her message to the neighborhood made it sound like the meeting would settle the issue once and for all. But early on the morning of that meeting, my phone buzzed with a message that made me pause. The fire marshal's office had reviewed the photos I sent, and they confirmed they would be investigating the blocked fire lane. When I read the message from the fire marshal's office that morning, I realized the situation had just changed. They had already reviewed the photos I sent. According to the reply, the blocked lane appeared to violate emergency access regulations, and an inspector would be looking into it. That was the first moment since this whole mess started that I felt like someone outside the neighborhood was actually taking the issue seriously. Still, I knew Cynthia wouldn't back down easily. Before the meeting that evening, I spent a few hours gathering every piece of documentation I could find. I printed the HOA landscaping approval notice that Cynthia's board had circulated months earlier. The document clearly showed the board had authorized the placement of the decorative barriers. If anyone asked who made the decision to block the fire lane, the answer would be right there in black and white. Later that afternoon, a few neighbors stopped by my workshop. Maria Gutierrez was one of them. She told me several residents were planning to attend the meeting, even if they didn't speak publicly. People were starting to realize the issue wasn't just about landscaping anymore, it was about safety. Still, most of them were nervous about confronting the HOA board directly. I didn't blame them. Cynthia had made it clear that anyone who challenged her decisions could expect violation notices or inspections soon afterward. I also made one important decision that day. I didn't tell anyone from the HOA about the message from the fire marshal's office. If they knew an inspection might be coming, They would probably rush to remove the barriers and pretend the problem had never existed. Instead, I walked into the clubhouse that evening like nothing unusual was happening. The room was already full. Cynthia sat at the front table with the rest of the board, a thick binder open in front of her. As soon as the meeting started, she began speaking about ongoing disruptions in the neighborhood. Then she said my name. According to Cynthia, I had been spreading misinformation, contacting outside agencies, and creating unnecessary fear among residents. A few people shifted in their chairs, and just as Cynthia leaned forward to continue her speech, red emergency lights suddenly flashed through the clubhouse windows outside. For a moment, nobody in the room moved. The red lights outside the clubhouse windows flickered across the walls, reflecting off the long table where the HOA board sat. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, and every head slowly turned toward the front doors. Then the doors opened. Two firefighters stepped inside first, followed by a tall man in a dark uniform carrying a clipboard. His badge read, Fire Marshal. The room fell completely silent. The marshal glanced around the meeting hall before speaking. We received a report about a blocked emergency access lane in this neighborhood, he said calmly. Which one of you represents the homeowners association? Cynthia straightened in her chair immediately. I'm the HOA president, she said, forcing a polite smile. I'm Cynthia Calder. There must be some misunderstanding. The marshal looked down at the photos clipped to his report. We'll determine that shortly, he replied. Several residents shifted uncomfortably while the firefighters stood near the doorway. The tension in the room felt heavy enough to touch. Cynthia tried to keep control of the situation. The landscaping you're referring to is decorative, she said quickly. It's part of a beautification project approved by the HOA board. The barriers are temporary. The fire marshal didn't argue. Instead, he calmly explained the law. If a road is designated as a fire lane, he said, it must remain open and accessible to emergency vehicles at all times. Decorative installations cannot block it. A few murmurs spread through the crowd. Maria Gutierrez stood from her seat near the back of the room. That lane was used during the brush fire years ago, she said. Fire trucks came through there. Another neighbor nodded. So did an ambulance last winter. Cynthia's expression tightened, but she quickly tried to redirect the meeting. This is still an HOA matter, she insisted. We were in the middle of official business. The marshal closed his clipboard. Not anymore. He glanced toward the firefighters waiting at the door. We're going to inspect that fire lane right now. Chairs scraped across the floor as people stood up almost at the same time. Nobody wanted to stay inside the clubhouse now. One by one, residents followed the firefighters out into the cool evening air. The flashing red lights from the fire truck washed across the street as the crowd slowly moved toward the narrow road behind the houses. Cynthia walked ahead of everyone, trying to keep her confident posture, but I could see the tension in the way she held her shoulders. The fire marshal stopped at the entrance to the fire lane and studied the large stone barrier sitting directly across the path. Two firefighters began measuring the width of the lane while the marshal took photos with his phone and wrote notes on his clipboard. The silence around us was thick. Finally, Cynthia spoke. These stones are part of an approved landscaping project, she said firmly. The HOA has full authority over the design of community property. The marshal didn't even look up from his clipboard. Design authority doesn't override emergency safety codes, he replied calmly. He pointed toward the barriers. This access lane must remain open for fire engines and medical vehicles. More neighbors had gathered now, standing along the sidewalk and watching closely. Some of them whispered to each other as the measurements continued. A few people who had supported Cynthia earlier in the meeting suddenly looked far less certain. One firefighter tried to maneuver around the barrier as if driving a large truck through the space. There wasn't nearly enough room. The fire marshal finished writing and turned toward Cynthia again. If this lane is blocked the way it is now, he said, emergency vehicles could lose critical minutes responding to a fire or medical call. The crowd had gone completely quiet. Then the marshal closed his clipboard. If these barriers stay here, he said clearly, the homeowners association may be facing a formal safety violation. The fire marshal looked down at the photos on his clipboard one last time before turning back toward Cynthia. His voice was calm, but there was no room for debate in it. These barriers cannot remain here, he said. This lane is designated emergency access. Blocking it violates county fire safety regulations. Cynthia crossed her arms. This landscaping was approved by the HOA board, she insisted. We followed the proper process. The marshal nodded slightly, as if he had heard that argument many times before. HOA approval doesn't override emergency access laws, he replied. If fire or medical vehicles cannot reach these homes quickly, lives could be at risk. A firefighter stepped forward beside him, pointing at the stone barriers. A full-size fire engine would never make it through this opening, he said. The crowd around us had grown quiet. Several neighbors exchanged uneasy looks as the reality of the situation started sinking in. The fire marshal pulled a form from his clipboard and began writing. "This is an official safety violation notice," he announced. "The obstruction must be removed immediately." Cynthia's confident posture finally cracked. "You can't just shut down our meeting," she said sharply. The marshal looked directly at her. "This meeting is not the priority right now," he said. "Emergency access is." Then he turned toward the firefighters. "Let's clear the lane." The firefighters began directing a few workers who had originally installed the landscaping stones. With several people lifting together, the heavy decorative barriers were slowly pulled away from the center of the road. Each one moved aside revealed more of the narrow lane that had been hidden for months. A murmur spread through the crowd. Then someone clapped. Another neighbor joined in. Before long, several residents were applauding quietly, not loudly enough to turn it into a scene, but enough to show where the neighborhood's opinion had shifted. Cynthia stood near the edge of the road, her expression tight and silent. For the first time since this entire situation started, she didn't have anything to say. Within minutes, the fire lane was completely open again. The marshal made one final note on his clipboard before closing it. Until the violation was resolved and the lane remained clear, the HOA meeting was officially over. The next few weeks changed the neighborhood in ways I don't think anyone expected. The HOA board had no choice but to remove the landscaping project completely. The stone barriers were taken away, the planters were relocated, and the entire fire lane was cleared and repainted with bright emergency markings. Within days, the access road behind the houses looked the way it should have from the beginning, open, visible, and ready for emergency vehicles if they were ever needed again. But the bigger change happened inside the HOA itself. Once residents realized the board had ignored a serious safety rule, people started asking questions. At the next community meeting, several homeowners spoke up about how the situation had been handled. Some said they had raised concerns months earlier but were dismissed. Others said they were tired of decisions being made without proper discussion. Before long, the pressure on the board grew too strong to ignore. Cynthia Calder resigned as HOA president not long after that meeting. A new group of residents stepped forward to help run the association, promising that future decisions would involve more transparency and actual input from the community. For me, life slowly returned to normal. The road behind our home stayed open, clearly marked as a fire lane, and emergency vehicles could once again pass through without obstacles. And every time I drove past that cleared path, I was reminded of something important. Sometimes the people who claim they're protecting a neighborhood are the very ones who need to be questioned. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?